Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro.
Yes.
And it's, it's the Bible Bistro on the road.
It is the bistro on the road.
Right.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah.
Where are we, Brian?
We're in Chambana. I don't know, Champaign or Urbana. Are we?
Champaign
I think technically we're in Urbana right now.
That was some linguistic work that you just did there, combining Champaign and Urbana.
Oh, everybody does
Illinois, yes, everybody does it. But we're here. We've got a special guest with us today.
Yeah, we're excited. Jon Weatherly's here with us for the third time.
The third time, and it's great to be a guest in my own home. I appreciate that a great deal.
We appreciate your generosity with that.
Well, I mean, you brought the Bistro food truck here, essentially.
yeah,
we did. Yeah.
Of course, you made us coffee and you made us cookies.
Well, I
too,
didn't make the cookies.
Okay.
I didn't even thaw the cookies. But there they
But did you put them on the table for us?
I didn't even put them on the table.
I was trying to throw a bone to you.
I did make the coffee.
Yes,
that
thank
was
you.
good. It's
delicious.
Good coffee.
Pioneer Bible translators.
Do you want to tell about where we had lunch? We had lunch in Champaign.
In Champaign. Yes, we had
Sticky Rice was the name of the restaurant.
And I had a green curry, and it was delightful.
I had pad see ew, which is one of my favorite Thai foods.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is I asked him for, you never know when you go to a new restaurant. First time I'd been there, and they said, do you want this mild or medium or hot? And I went with medium. Mm-hmm. And then I asked them for additional spices, and they brought out Thai spice, and it's so good. Some fresh Thai chilies, and very, very good. And I felt good at the end. The waitress said, next time you come, you could probably go hot or even Thai hot.
And then Lao hot is even beyond that.
Oh,
my God.
But I have been, I was told, I said, I want blah, blah, and I want hot. She said, do you want that? That's like a 10. I said, what's medium? She said about a 6. I said, go with medium.
Medium.
I am a medium guy at Sticky Rice. Okay?
Well,
I said you never know. Every time you go to a new place, it's always a little different.
That's
right?
true.
That Lao hot has to be like Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant, where the face melts at the end when they open it up.
But it was a very good restaurant.
It was. It was very good. Enjoyed it. And we're so glad that we're here.
Yeah,
I am too.
Yeah.
Yes,
but we didn't come here to talk about Laotian food, or
we did not. Surprisingly, I do eat. So we're going to talk about, what are we talking about today, John?
Well, first of all, last time we introduced John, he had a different position. So do you want to tell us a little bit what you're doing now and why you're
in July, I became associate pastor at Twin City Bible Church here in Urbana. I was just looking for the chance for one more adventure, and Tammy and I thought it would be interesting to be in a church which was multi-ethnic and was pursuing that deliberately, or to be in a church that's in a university town, and lo and behold, we discovered this church. And it's both of those things. So our building is right across the street from the U of I campus. We have a lot of U of I people, a lot of students, a lot of faculty and staff who are part of this. It's just really, really interesting conversations you get to have with people in a place like this. People literally from all over the world.
I think it's neat.
We've got a couple who are new to town. They're from Indonesia, and they're helping with worship leadership. And this just blows my mind. So it's a lot of fun.
This is the real question. All that sounds fantastic. The real question is, okay, you're originally a Hoosier.
Yeah, I'm originally from Indiana.
And you lived for a period of time in Tennessee.
I lived in Tennessee.
You lived in Cincinnati for a long period of time, and now you're in Illinois.
Yeah.
This time of year's basketball season.
Yeah, that's right.
So who do you root for?
Everybody.
You can't lose.
Well, let's just confine ourselves to the original Big Ten. I've got 2 teams from growing up in Indiana. I've got another one from living in Ohio. Our son went to grad school at Wisconsin. Our daughter went to undergrad at Northwestern. Okay. Not that matters much for basketball.
Right now, I think they're in second place.
They have been on a tear. There's something wrong. Okay. Because if they make the tournament, this will only be the second time.
Right.
So add U of I to that. That's just 6 of the original 10 teams of the Big Ten.
You have representation.
There. And now you're really thinking of the periphery at this point, because Minnesota and Iowa.
Yeah.
Really?
I lived in Maryland, so.
Yeah, that's fake Big Ten. So
not even counting USC or UCLA,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so you're not gonna commit here. Is what you're saying.
No, win in Rome. ILLINI.
Okay,
I've learned how to spell that.
Remind me to tell you about the basketball game I saw last week. I was there when Indiana played Illinois. And there was a pro. Well, I'll go ahead and tell it since I started this.
Yeah, because everybody's watching.
There was a pro wrestler there who was. There's going to be a event there.
No doubt.
And so he was there promoting it. And so he was doing all this stuff. And so he picked up on this thing. So basically everybody ends their announcements. If you've never been to a University of Illinois basketball game with ILL, and then the crowd shouts back INI. Well, he picked up on this, but then he would at the end of each of his things say ILI. Everybody's kind of looking at him like, I said to the lady next to me who I didn't know, I said, clearly he is not using his brains for his profession as a professional wrestler.
Right. Basic literacy is not a requirement for the WWE.
So, anyway, well,
there's the story.
I hadn't planned on telling that story.
But here we are.
So why we do have Jon here today is Jon, as you might remember, if you've been a long-time listener of this podcast, his area of New Testament that he spends the most time in, has spent the most time in, is Luke Acts. And so one of the passages in Luke that people often ask about is Luke 21. We call it, well, what do you call it? What do you?
I usually refer to this passage and its parallels in Mark 13 and Matthew 24 as the Olivet Discourse, because Jesus is delivering this from the Mount of Olives. But sometimes it's called the little apocalypse of the Gospels because it is language which draws from the Jewish apocalyptic tradition and deals with the question of what's going to happen. And how do we understand the future? And so on that basis, it becomes the subject of a lot of inquiry, and a lot of claims are made on the basis of these texts and so forth.
Well, that's why we thought we would have you explain this today. We talk about the book of Revelation a lot. It's one of the things that we get listeners interested in.
It is amazing how interested people are.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us what kind of questions do you think people typically bring to this, or how do they talk about this a lot?
It's generally the same kinds of questions that they're bringing to these other, apocalyptic texts, as we call them, and this has to do with what is the nature of the time we're living in now? Is this the beginning of the end? When is the end of the world coming? What is going to happen before the end? How should I understand that? How should I respond to it? How should I be ready for it? In more specific terms, they'll say, now surely this has got something to do with the geography of Palestine and Israel, with the physical city of Jerusalem, etc. There's a lot of Zionism, as we sometimes call it, that is tied in with this. So all of those kinds of questions get asked. And whenever you run into a new world crisis, like the war in Ukraine, for example, people start combing these texts looking for clues. And you have people like Pat Robertson who are saying, well, obviously the Russians are attacking Ukraine so they can get to Israel. He obviously did not consult a map when he made that statement, but leaving that aside, we can say that there's plenty of interest in this text, or in this trio of texts. We're looking specifically at Luke, which is based on those specific kinds of concerns. My kind of, shall I call it, my beef with that, or my concern about that, is that I think it is pulling this text out of its literary context and out of its historical context in ways that do damage to a thoughtful Christian understanding of what God is doing in the world and how his people are called to respond to that. So it is at best a distraction, and at worst, it is sometimes a blasphemy. I'll just put it that strongly. And so stay tuned.
I was going to say, we'll ask about that for sure. You're right. I mean, you got these world Russia's always a player in this. I remember even back since I was a kid.
Very big in the Bible.
Somebody said, "Oh, you're a Bible college student here. You need to read this book." The late great Planet Earth, and Russia was big in that. But then you also have, the stuff even this week that's gone on with the continual stuff between Jerusalem and
the Palestinian
question there,
conflict, etc.
And so I think regularly people come up with this issue,
and probably between the time that we record this and the time that it actually hits the internet, there's going to be something else
will happen. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And actually, broadly speaking, that's in here, with the message. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
That's very much the perspective.
Well, give us some of the literary context then.
First of all,
how would you approach this?
First of all, in Luke, as in the other two synoptic gospels, Matthew and Mark, this text comes about, so far through what we typically think of as the passion narrative. And I'm going to use that in a broader sense. Sometimes that is seen to begin actually in Luke chapter 22, for example, in a narrow sense. If you just to use this as an example, if you if your Good Friday habit is to listen to the entirety of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, then that the text of that is the chapters immediately after this section in Matthew. But I'm using Passion narrative more broadly to refer to everything from Jesus' triumphal entry forward. And so in that sense, we're in the middle of that discourse. So Jesus has come to Jerusalem. He has, very tellingly in Luke's gospel, the Pharisees say, "Hey, Jesus, tell your disciples to be quiet." This is how they sound.
Italian.
I had no idea.
They're gangsters. They're
gangsters.
Okay,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, buddy, hey. And Jesus says, I tell you the truth. If they're quiet, even the stones will cry out. And this is a very pregnant phrase because, first of all, it's drawing on Old Testament imagery where inanimate creation praises God.
Right.
And so Jesus is predicating something divine about himself in that. But it's also establishing in the narrative of Luke a catchword because there are stones all over the place.
Right.
After this, including especially in the lead into this, because at the beginning of this, Jesus says, "Not one stone will be left on another." Yeah. So a part of what's happening here, just to appreciate this, is to understand that this text is in part a prophetic announcement of the expression of God's judgment against Jesus' opponents.
Okay.
Say
that again.
Okay.
But slower.
Okay. No,
for me.
That's good.
I probably won't say it exactly the same way. Okay.
But I liked what you said.
It's a prophetic announcement of the expression of God's judgment against Jesus' opponents.
Right.
Those opponents being, and this has been important to me for a long time, those opponents being not the Jews. Please, Christians, stop saying that.
Right.
Even if you heard about the AP style book saying, don't say the French, and you thought that was ridiculous, don't say the Jews. It just leads to all kinds of mischief. Jesus is not saying the Jews are rejecting me. Jesus' opponents are the temple leadership.
Yeah.
Okay. It is, he's been saying since chapter 9 in the Gospel of Luke, I'm going to Jerusalem, the high priests, the elders, and the scribes, which is a way of saying the Sanhedrin, the high priest and his associates. So even though Jesus has various opponents through the narrative, as the narrative is constructed, and this is true in all the synoptics, the people who take him to his death are the priestly aristocracy, the Sanhedrin, the Hasmonean dynasty, and their associates. So their power is focused in the temple, and this announcement then is saying the destruction of the temple is coming as an expression of God's judgment against my opponents. And I say expression because I would want to underline anything that happens in this present age, which the Bible identifies as God's judgment, is an expression of the larger judgment. It is not simply that Jerusalem is destroyed and that ipso facto is the entirety of the experience of judgment. It's not even judgment for everybody who experiences it. Okay.
Right.
But it is.
We were just talking about this
at lunch.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, you can think about this, and one of the canonical antecedents of this event is the first destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Babylonians.
Now, exactly, by the Babylonians.
Which is what we were talking about.
Well, good.
We were just talking about Jeremiah.
What would you discuss over
Laotian food, right?
Thai and Laotian food, other than the destruction of Jerusalem?
Right.
And boy, this food is really spicy. That makes me think of the destruction of Jerusalem.
Things got spicy then too.
They did indeed. So, you think about the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is unequivocal about this.
Right.
This is coming because we don't listen to God.
Yeah.
But Jeremiah listens to God.
Sure. And others with him.
And he's got to live through this mess.
Yeah.
Okay. So what does it mean for them? Well, what is judgment for one may be, to use a 25-cent theological word, tribulation, which simply means trouble, for another. It is, and so this is kind of the two sides of the coin of this event. Jesus is warning his followers to anticipate this, not to misinterpret it, because this could be all of these events, including the general chaos of the world at large, All of these events are things that can easily be misinterpreted as signs that we picked the wrong Messiah.
Okay.
We bet on the wrong horse. We hitched our wagon to,
Is that why his disciples are interested in this question then?
Well, that's a great question. I think they're interested in it because they are very much seeing Jesus in conventional messianic terms, which means he's going to be a political military king. So, and if we take a few steps back to pick up another thread of this, as Jesus comes into Jerusalem, stones, etc., in the Lucan triumphal entry, he goes to the temple. And does his action in the temple, which I think in literary context is best understood as another prophetic announcement of the coming judgment on the temple leadership.
When he stops the worship of the temple.
Yes, when he stops the money changers, etc. This is there corruption? Probably, etc.
Right.
Does Luke have an important theme about wealth versus poverty? Yes, in fact, the tiny little episode that appears right before this discourse in Luke is the story of the widow who gives her 2 little copper coins compared to the extent of the treasury. So all of that is there. But as the thing continues, Jesus is asked, by what authority do you do this?
Right.
And he says, I'm not going to answer unless you answer my question, and they don't. And then in typical Jesus fashion, he does answer with a parable. Okay.
Right. So the question he asked was, what authority did John the Baptist do the things?
He says, by what authority did John? Yeah, I'll tell you my authority to do what I did in the temple. If you tell me John's authority to baptize,
because he knows that puts them
and he puts them on the horns of a dilemma. If we say God's, he'll say, well, why didn't you listen? And if we say man's, then everybody will hate us because everybody thinks John is a prophet. So we won't answer. And Jesus says, I won't either. And then he does.
Right.
Okay. Because he takes a story from Jeremiah and remixes it. Jeremiah has a story of a vineyard. What is it, Jeremiah? It's somewhere before chapter 6. I'm sorry, Isaiah. One of those guys. It's Isaiah. Isaiah has a story
prophets,
of maybe chapter 4. Y'all at home, you look this up.
It may be 5, but
4 or 5, that neighborhood.
That'll be your homework
single
for
digits.
This week.
Isaiah single digits.
This is like horseshoes and hand grenades. You just have to get close.
That's theology, right?
That's right. So Isaiah's story of a vineyard is of an unfruitful vineyard.
Right.
And then Isaiah lowers the boom and says, the vineyard is Israel.
Right.
And the vineyard owner is the Lord, and he's going to destroy the vineyard.
Right.
Well, Jesus takes that story and makes it about the tenants in the vineyard who don't pay the vineyard owner. And so he sends various folk to them and they reject them. And finally, he says, I will send my son. They will respect my son. And the guys in the vineyard say the stupidest thing that anyone in the Bible ever says, which is, let's kill the vineyard owner's son, and then the vineyard will be ours. Okay, like, really? Okay, so they do that. And then, of course, Jesus asks rhetorically, what will the owner of the vineyard do to those guys? And the answer is, he'll get rid of them and put someone else in charge.
Right.
And then you read scribes and the scribes and the priests. Word Pharisee doesn't occur in any of this, for what it's worth. The high priests and the scribes are just incensed because they know that Jesus is talking about them. Okay. Now, by what authority do you do this? I'm the Son, and you reject the Son. Okay, and so now we come to, but we should mention as well, all of this temple stuff is very, call it small m messianic,
right?
Because the great son of David, according to 2 Samuel 7, and you knew I would mention that eventually, famous in teaching to say, I don't know what this is, but it has something to do with 2 Samuel 7. The promise,
verses 5b through.
The promise that God makes to David is that David's great son will build God's house.
Right.
Okay. So temple is very messianic. Why does Herod the Great want to rebuild the temple? It's a claim to be the true king.
Sure.
And so forth. So Jesus goes into the temple, very small and messianic act. But now what he's saying is, I am indeed building a temple, but you guys, we're on a different page. This place is going to be destroyed for other reasons.
Right.
And so a part of this discourse is to disentangle that idea of temple and what the destruction of the temple must mean.
Okay.
If you are thinking along conventional messianic lines, if you're thinking along conventional messianic lines, destroying this temple means we're going to build a true temple.
When you bring in building the temple, you're talking about the John, what he says in John, or is there other places
I mean,
he says
it's very similar.
Well?
I mean, I don't, unlike many of my colleagues in the guild, I don't see the Gospels as saying very much different.
But
from
I'm saying,
is
that in Luke too? Is it also in Luke?
Destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it.
Yeah, that kind of an idea.
Interestingly, no. Okay. In Matthew and Mark, you have that specific saying is in the testimony at Jesus' trial.
At his trial, when they said he said that he would do this, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But only John is the one who puts it in Jesus' mouth.
John is the one who puts it in Jesus' mouth.
Right.
But Jesus is, of course, doing temple stuff all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
The claim to forgive sins is saying, I am the true temple.
Right. And we've, for our listeners, we've talked about this, and
exactly.
You can find an episode on this.
I know you don't.
Right.
If you're going to talk, eventually you're going to get to temple. Right. I know how this goes. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And along these lines. But you very definitely got to disentangle this. To put it maybe most simply, which would be refreshing for our listeners, that if you are among the 12 listening to this, if Jesus is saying not one stone will be left on another, that sounds to you like, okay, we've got a building program that's going to begin.
Okay.
He's going to destroy this temple so we can build the real one, the true temple of fulfillment. Now, and we're going to record an episode about Acts along with Luke with this, to think in the large and anticipate a little bit of that. A part of what Acts does is modify our understanding of temple. That instead of fulfillment coming as the nations come to the temple, fulfillment comes as the temple goes to the nations.
Okay.
So there's a way that I think that develops there.
Okay.
So all of this is going along with kind of what we might think of as the larger issue of understanding and misunderstanding in the nature of what Jesus is doing, which is the already not yet aspect of the reign of God. Okay. If I understand God's king comes to establish God's reign, which means the defeat of evil, the vindication of God's people and their blessing, and the punishment of God's enemies, it's going to puzzle and vex me that God's enemies seem to be rather active.
Okay.
And so a part of this is to say, as we said before, don't worry about it. Not that it's inconsequential, but it doesn't mean that you're in the wrong messianic group, that you backed the wrong Messiah, that something has gone terribly wrong, that this is the larger working out of what God is doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are some of the parts of the text here that, so I'll kind of give our listeners a little bit of background here. You mentioned the widow's mite, which I thought was interesting, and then the disciples are in the temple, so it's in this setting, and they were marking on the building, because the building would have been one of the most magnificent buildings.
Yeah, and it's really, and we were chatting beforehand about our respective trips to Israel. Yeah. It's amazing to me that in my lifetime we've come to a much greater understanding of the real splendor of the Herodian temple.
Right.
And the whole thing was kind of designed to make this fabulous impression on people. The building, is visible from miles outside of Jerusalem. Sure. And the typical entrance would have come through a tunnel. Right. So that you're in darkness, and then it's like what people say when they go into Wrigley Field. You come through, and then you see all this green. Right. Well, in this case, you come through and you see all this white, because it's all of this, all of this sparkly stone marble and granite and so forth that just gleams in the sunshine. And most people have rented a special garment to put on, this white, so it's just white everywhere. Okay. And would just have this dazzling effect. And Josephus says the stones were cut off-site to size so they could be fitted together like so many enormous Legos on the side of the temple, so that there was no hammering. But that is in itself an impressive achievement of engineering, and there would be admiration for the stones. Yeah,
and the stones that are left there are massive.
Oh, they are. Yeah.
Massive stones.
Yeah, we were talking about that too. You see the stones on the south side of the temple that the Romans had toppled over. You go through the rabbinic temple and you see these foundation stones that are just tons and tons, and you see that kind of thing. So when Jesus says what he says in verse 6, in response to the reaction to the beauty of the temple,
and the gifts dedicated to God, which I'd never noticed that until you talked about the widow's mite.
That's all these rich people who are, getting their little named pavilion.
Which, by the way, still happens, right?
You might say that.
Well, I was going to say that behind the Western Wall, you've got all those places that have the signs that are dedicated to the...
Oh, I was thinking more of like places I've worked.
I won't talk.
Okay,
let's not go institution. Let's stay focused on the text.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've
speaking of
not
one stone standing on the other.
Oh my!
What can I say?
Moving along in the book of Acts.
Yeah. Well, or Luke. We'll get to Acts. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So admiration for the stones, and Jesus says, not one stone will be will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Got to hear that as an allusion to the stones will cry out. And when Jesus says after the parable of the vineyard, and he quotes from Psalm 118, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief stone. Okay, so he's identified himself as the chief stone. There's some fun stuff going on there that we won't explore specifically. But all of this is linking up. And so all of this is really relevant to the question, who is the true king? What do we make of his opponents? What is the true temple? How is God doing his thing? And the beginning of the discourse then is about don't be deceived when things don't go the way you want them to or you expect them to. If I'm the true king, this should mean that God will reign, that righteousness will prevail, that evil will be defeated. And this, in fact, is not going to be the case. So other people will, in this environment, claim to be Messiah and don't listen to them. I'm Messiah. They'll, effectively they're saying he's not Messiah because, look, the world is not what it should be. I'm Messiah. I will bring what God wants, and that's not going to happen.
When you say it in that way, you're not talking about just those who are making specific claims, like the person who would claim they're a ham sandwich or I'm the Messiah or that kind of thing. But you're talking about anybody who would say that I'm the savior of the world. Basically, I'm the one who's come.
And of course it's. There's an enormous number of messianic claimants in this late Second Temple period.
Sure.
One of the things I appreciate about a video that N.T. Wright made a number of years ago is he's talking about that, and they just let scroll by the names of all these guys that we read in Josephus, and then you go on to early rabbinic period, and so forth.
So he is more specifically talking about those messianic
claimants.
There,
but I mean, as we think about this, it's not just someone who says I'm Messiah or he's Messiah. It's, as you said, someone who said I have the solution to the world's problems. If we just
look
have
to me,
just have global laissez-faire capitalism, no. If we just have global socialism, no. If we just have this, that, or the other. If we could just become vegan anti-vaxxers or whatever it might be, that we straighten all of this kind of thing out. So don't listen to the other claimants. And then verse 9, you hear of wars and uprisings. Do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away. Now, sometimes we read this as if Jesus is saying things are, and this continues, should maybe just throw in 10 and 11, nation rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes, famines, pestilences in various places. Just throw in pandemic in place of pestilence if you want to get a feel for this. And fearful events and great signs from heaven.
All that stuff.
All that stuff.
Green comments,
Folks read this on TV and on the radio, and they read it as if it's saying there's going to be more of this stuff. Well, no, Jesus is not saying there's going to be more. This is life as people knew it at this time.
Right. Sure.
I mean, we may think that the norm ought to be peace and health, but ancient people were very acquainted with death.
Right.
They died at the same rate we do, just a lot quicker and more painfully. On balance. Just something fascinating that I learned from one of our professional colleagues at a conference a couple of years ago. The current estimate is that in the Greco-Roman world, 40% of people had intestinal worms.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
So just imagine eating. Southeast Asian food under those circumstances. Just the general level of human misery.
Right.
And so what Jesus is saying is the general level of human misery is going to persist.
Continue. Yeah.
Do not be alarmed by that. Do not think that because the kingdom of God has not arrived in its fullness that you have believed the wrong Messiah.
So similar to what we've said with Revelation, really what brings that question up is hey, if the Messiah really has come, then why is it still the way it is?
Why do we have the four horsemen of the apocalypse?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah, well, there is a judgment to come.
Yeah, if he's defeated death, why are we still
dying,
suffering?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. No, and this is it. This is the already and the not yet.
Realized in future eschatology.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. And then goes on and talks about persecution. And this is sort of a programmatic statement that leads to the book of Acts. Okay. As I anticipate we will talk about, a question that we would have as readers of the book of Acts is everything I hear about this Christian movement true? Because I hear that they're a bunch of outlaws, that they're hated everywhere, that they're led by criminals. I mean, they worship a crucified guy, which is bad for a start.
Right.
Okay. And the answer is no. This is actually how God is doing his work in the world. This is actually always how God has done his work in the world.
Right.
The prophets, Jesus is very big on comparing himself to the prophets in Luke. The prophets were persecuted, so am I, so will you be. Right. And so that's what's being said here. In this, you will bear testimony to me. I'm about to be crucified, so in your rejection and suffering which you receive in my name, you will bear testimony to me. And you don't have to worry about this because the Spirit will empower you to say what needs to be said. The Spirit comes in Luke, Acts to empower prophetic speech. Prophetic not in the sense of predictive, but in the sense of declaring the message of God. And so that is declared by messengers who are in their very existence prophetic by the way that they live in the world. And so this is going on. Betrayed by parents, brothers, sisters, relatives, all of that. Everybody will hate you, but not a hair of your head will perish. And that's where we get a typical Jesus paradox. Wait, they just killed me. How can you say not a hair of my head perished? I took care of you. They gave you death. I give you life. They cannot take life from you. There's life after death, and there is life after death.
Right.
Yeah. So, and this is important too. When we come to the end of the discourse, I have a distinct understanding of one of the more problematic statements that Jesus makes in this text, and I think it has to do with that very idea. Everything that Jesus promises his followers, he promises to all of them, irrespective of where they live on the so-called timeline.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you are here in the first generation, he says, you're going to experience everything, the bad and the fullness of the blessing. I'm not going to abandon you. You're not going to miss out. This is like Paul in 1 Thessalonians saying, don't worry about those who have died. They come with the Lord. And so we will all be with the Lord together.
Right.
Yeah. Nobody misses out.
I see.
No one is, what's that phrase? Left behind.
Like the parable. It's a parable of the workers in the field. Everybody gets the talent, whether they worked half the day or.
Yeah, that's right.
In a way.
Right. Exactly. That God is faithful. Jesus is faithful. He does not abandon his people. This doesn't happen the way you would like for it to happen. It doesn't happen as fast as you would like. Trust yourself to the Lord. Don't worry about what you're going to say. I've got you.
Okay. And you're not going to miss out. You're not going to.
There is no missing out. Darn, I wish I was here. I wish I'd been born a generation later.
Right.
You're fine. You're fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Then verse 20.
Yeah, this is where we get to the meat here, right?
Yeah, well, it's kind of, all parts of the sandwich are important.
You got to have the bread.
Yeah,
otherwise
it's
not a sandwich.
Right. Those lettuce wrap things. That's just
it's for the birds.
Some of us have to.
The rabbits.
I realize.
Brian's afflictions.
Well, we all experiment with the keto diet now and then.
It's pestilence. Well, no, it's not that. We'll talk about it another time.
Okay, all right.
We'll have the episode on my sicknesses later.
Okay, all right.
You can look forward to that later in season 3.
I'm old enough to have a discussion of all my aches and pains too. We could do that. We can do another.
Two old men kvetching.
That's it. That's it. Okay.
That's a whole other podcast.
That's a whole other podcast.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, now. This is, I think, something that we understand best, first of all, if we live in the world of Second Temple Judaism.
Okay.
If you hear that phrase as someone in this period, you think, oh, I know things like this because you know that Jerusalem has been laid siege to before. It was laid siege
even before it was destroyed.
That's right. That's right.
Sennacherib.
This is especially interesting, I think, because Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians after a siege. It had been laid siege generations before by the Assyrians. Okay. And of course, God miraculously delivers Jerusalem, which is fascinating when you come to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah chapter 7, kind of the distillation of the whole message of Jeremiah, is saying, you guys think that the temple is magic because it's God's place and he won't let it fall like happened before. Yeah. And I'm telling you, it ain't his temple anymore.
Yeah. And there were prophets telling people that it was going to be like before. That's interesting.
Yeah,
that is interesting.
And so they had a false sense of divine confidence. And the Jeremiah destroys. And interestingly, Jesus has already brought this up, because when he says in the temple, when he's taking his action in the temple earlier, it is written, my house will be a house of prayer. That's Isaiah 56. But you have made it a den of robbers, thieves, lais, insurrectionists.
Right.
Well, he's quoting Jeremiah chapter 7.
Right. Oh, interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
Yeah. So he's saying, as it was, so it is. Okay. So when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and this is going to be like the Babylonians, because the message here is, well, there are two places to be in a siege, and one is bad in the middle of the siege. So get out of town.
Right.
Leave town. Why would you not leave town? Because you think you're going to win. Okay.
Right.
And we're not going to win.
So he's basically saying this is going to be the latter kind of being surrounded by armies.
This is going to mean Jerusalem is going to fall. It is again an expression of God's judgment against his enemies. Who,
if you're in the country, don't come into the city.
Don't come in. Okay. If you're in, go out. If you don't come in. And then we get some pretty conventional Near Eastern siege language. Okay. When I read this now, I read it. I think of it in the voice of the comic book guy on The Simpsons.
Right.
Worst siege ever.
Right.
Okay. Which is the way, I mean, this is conventional Near Eastern hyperbolic language. And I hesitate to call it hyperbolic.
Right.
Because if
Josephus tells us that this happened,
if you're in the middle of a city starving to death while you're not being, stabbed to death, that's a bad situation. Yeah. I can't imagine very many things worse. But the key thing here is not to imagine that there's like a sufferometer and this is somehow going to be worse than, in some kind of measurable term than the Holocaust or something like this. Okay. That's not the point. This is simply to say this is terrible. It is supremely to be avoided. Why do we talk about pregnant women and nursing mothers? This is very conventional language. You can find this in the Old Testament. They're vulnerable because they're not terribly mobile and they need extra nutrition.
Right.
So all of that is at stake here. Fall by the sword, taken as prisoners. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. That, I think, is a simple statement to say this is an event that's going to take place and then it's going to be over.
Okay.
A lot of people read that times of the Gentiles as if there's a kind of a turning away from the people of Israel as the objects of God's salvation to the Gentiles. The book of Acts does not bear this out.
Let me be devil's advocate here
Please
for
do.
a moment. And I use that intentional. No, I mean, I agree with him. That's why I'm putting myself in this place intentionally, though, because verse 20, so we talked about Isaiah, Jeremiah. What about Daniel? You've got that desolation in 20.
Thank you for mentioning that.
And then you've got this idea, he's all about these times and these future events and these years and days and weeks and all that kind of stuff. So how does that play in?
I don't know. Okay, there's a lot about Daniel in that respect that I'm not in a position to disentangle, but there are two things that I think I do know.
Okay, all right.
The first is that when you read this passage in Matthew and Mark, instead of Jerusalem surrounded by armies, what you see is when you see the abomination of desolation. Which is a phrase from the book of Daniel. I think it occurs, 2 or 3 times?
7 and 10 at least, yeah.
Yeah. Or
is it 7 and 9?
One of the horseshoes and hand grenades.
Yeah, there we go.
It was widely understood in Jesus' time that the abomination of desolation referred to the actions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the guy who, the Greek Syrian king who takes over the temple, puts up an image of himself, sacrifices pigs, really leads a genocidal campaign against.
We've talked about this before a little bit, but pre dedication, pre Hanukkah stuff.
AD AD 160s.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Widely understood. So in that respect, what Jesus is doing is saying, again, I mean, as we look at the difference here, it's another as it was, so it will be, where there's going to be someone else who is going to stop sacrifice in the temple.
Sure. Okay.
And the answer to that is the Romans are going to destroy the temple.
Right.
So, we could talk about which did Jesus say, abomination of desolation or Jerusalem surrounded by armies. It's a distinction without a difference.
Okay.
Because both of those highways lead to the same conclusion.
Okay.
The core semantic meaning is the same. The historic associations are different. But at that point, we just understand all the more thoroughly how this story is a continuation, a repetition of what Israel's story has already been.
Okay.
In that respect.
They've been down this path before.
We have been down this path before. So that's item 1 on Daniel. Item 2, I think, is the critical thing that I understand about Jesus from the book of Daniel is that Jesus identifies himself with the Son of Man of Daniel, chapter 7. Mm-hmm. So he is the one who defeats the beastly kingdoms and establishes the reign of God. Okay. And he is the true Israelite, the true Adam, the true son of David, the true King of Israel. That much is clear. I think we could get a pretty good debate going on some of the particulars of Daniel, and I just don't consider myself to be well enough. I don't read a word of Aramaic, and I struggle with Hebrew, so I don't presume to get involved in that too much.
Trampling by the Gentiles is where I was going with that, because you got that the holy city will be trampled by the Gentiles for time, 2 times, or times and a half a time. Okay.
Well, if we want to talk about, I'll just riff on that and say,
as I always say, I'm just going to make stuff up now. So.
Yeah, I mean,
I know you're not.
My first, well, yes, I am, but I'm making up a good thing. Mm-hmm. My first inclination would be to say, well, we've just got another example of this. Okay. The Gentiles have trampled on Jerusalem before. And they're going to do it again. Romans are going to do it again,
And we even talked about, when we were talking about Israel, I said one of the fascinating things for me is the stones, huge stones that the Roman soldiers of the temple platform that they levered off and it crashed down. It was utter desolation.
Yeah,
it was
right. Yeah, this was they were making a huge example of people.
Sure. Okay.
And that's the temple, the Arch of Titus back in Rome. What's that about? It's about this event. Right?
Interesting. I never thought of this. Of course, now it's controlled by a group of different. I'm talking about the temple platform today is controlled by a group of people from various Muslim organizations, but they're very careful about who goes up and that kind of thing. But during the Roman siege, I mean, it was just it was
bedlam.
It was. The Romans were trampling all over it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Well, and then, I mean, you can, I guess, what is it, about 60 years later that the Romans put a stop to people just going back to the ruins and sacrificing.
Right.
Yeah, because they see that as another source of seditious nationalism.
Okay.
Happening. Yeah. So all of this is, so to speak, at one level, practical advice. Don't find yourself in the middle of the siege. But in a larger sense, an interpretation of an event that says, don't you lose faith in me because this is happening.
Okay.
This doesn't mean you've believed in the wrong Messiah. This means the Messiah's enemies are being judged. Okay. And it is not to be understood as the event that precedes the event of the climax of God's plan or program. Okay. There is still more to come. Okay. And that's what we begin to get in verse 25. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Right. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads because your redemption is drawing near. Okay. All of the stuff in verses 25 and 26 is drawing out of what we might think of as stock prophetic language of the Old Testament for the way that God upsets the world's apple cart, to use a different metaphor, on the way to establishing his reign. And why things like the sun, moon, the stars, and that kind of thing. That's what people worshipped.
Right.
Okay. And Nations in anguish and perplexity. Let's think about the second psalm, the language there. Why do the nations rage? The people imagine a vain thing. Because they're in rebellion against God and against God's king. And God's king is enthroned in heaven and laughs at them.
Right.
And so kiss the Son lest he be angry with you. So the nations are in rebellion against the king because they pretend to their own kind of power. And this is now being overturned. And this for you, whereas it is terror for those who don't belong to God, for you, lift up your heads, because this is your redemption. This is the end of your enslavement.
So the Son of Man coming in a cloud, of course, again, that's
Daniel 7.
Right?
Yeah,
that's Danielic. But you're saying it's not talking about a specific kind of event. It's
Is this a reference to the second coming?
Right.
Yeah, it is. Okay. It is, but at an indefinite moment. Jesus is not saying Jerusalem falls and 2 weeks later, here I am.
Sure, this is the culmination of
and as I remarked to somebody who asked me about a related passage, the cloud is not a weather report here. This is an allusion to the cloud of God's presence. Right. God is and temple. Okay,
right.
This is God making the world His temple.
Okay,
that is the establishment then of the temple of fulfillment in all of its aspects. So in what follows then, Jesus is in essence saying, I've told you how to understand what's going on around you. Now I shouldn't say typically, many people read this as if Jesus is saying, if you read this carefully enough, you'll work out the timeline.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
He's not saying that. He's saying if you understand what I'm talking about, you will understand the significance of what you are going through.
Of any time.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Of any time. Man, the world's a mess. Where is God? Okay. If you're not saying that, you're not paying attention, right? And Jesus is giving the answer. I'm here.
Right.
I'm with my people. Okay. I haven't abandoned you. And I'm going to win. But hang on. You're not privy to the wares in the house. Okay. In all of that. And then verse 32, and this is where I said I've got this distinct take on this. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away.
Okay.
I may be misusing this language, and if so, I hope one of the listeners will
not say anything.
Will write me and straighten me out on this. But I would say we need to listen to this statement not just for the illocution, but for the perlocution. The illocution is the content of what's said. The perlocution is the effect that this has on the listener.
Okay.
The illocution is all of this is going to happen within your time. The perlocution is, I'm not going to abandon you. You're not going to miss out.
Okay.
And I think that's how we should understand the perlocution. This is a hard saying. This is a mysterious saying. It's one that would be difficult to believe in, for lack of a better term, I'll say strictly literal terms. If I'm living even in the first months of early Christianity, because poor Stephen gets killed.
Right.
Okay. And then, a few chapters later, James is gone as well. So, I don't understand this as a guarantee that everyone's going to live to see Jesus return. But then I see what Paul, I think, is doing with this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. The dead in Christ will rise first.
Okay.
And they come with the Lord. There's this paradoxical two-pronged way of expressing this, all of which has to do with the idea that God is so thoroughly faithful to his people that he never abandons them. Okay. I don't know which is better, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain. Yeah. And so you will not miss out on anything in that respect.
So just to catch up anybody that may not understand speech act theory and so forth on this. So the locution are the words.
The words themselves.
Illocution would be the effect
or the meaning.
The meaning of what it, and then the perlocution would be what the words with the effect,
the intended effect.
The intended effect.
Yeah, to use an example, if I were to say to you guys, hey guys, there are chocolate chip cookies on the table.
Right.
That is, the illocution is a statement about the location of certain objects in the world. Right. The perlocution is, I would like for you to enjoy
the cookies.
Please eat some cookies.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
which we will do.
Of course. Yeah, just not during the podcast.
I understand. I just want to make sure that everybody's listening that understood. You make sure, I mean, you explained it a little bit there.
Absolutely.
But just that,
I appreciate that.
It's good. It's a good way to think about it. And we, the interesting thing about speech act theory is it's simply a way to describe the way we use language on a regular basis. But when we get into difficult to interpret text or text that sometimes causes problem, it's good to sometimes break these down.
Yeah.
We do this all the time. Hey, do you have any ketchup? And the wag says, well, yes. And, but that was not my that was not the perlocutionary force, as we sometimes say. What I was saying is, could you please bring me some ketchup for my chocolate chip or my French fries?
And we have a whole diagnostic vocabulary for people who don't pick up on this stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and we talked about this at lunch. Even again, we've talked about everything at lunch that you were talking about. But talking about Jeremiah, because I'd read a book on how do we interpret prophecy and so forth, and it's like, thinking about, okay, is it about the words, or is it about what the prophet is trying to get the intention of these to wake them up? He's using words and hyperbole and metaphor to wake them up.
It's preaching.
Exactly. So anyway, we talked about everything. It all came together here perfectly on the podcast.
It does. Yeah.
All right.
So just to continue the closing part of the discourse. Is this image of somebody who is faithfully standing watch. And that's interesting too, because standing watch is something that's going to come up later when you go to the garden. Jesus, when he tells the disciples to stand watch,
right?
Well, it sounds like, the bad guys are coming, so let me know when they come. Right. But when they do come, he just surrenders to them.
Sure.
He says, here come the bad guys. Instead of running away from them, he goes toward them. So keeping watch is kind of a complex thing here. What does it mean to keep watch? Again, it's not you're going to be able to work out the timeline if you pay attention. It's basically watch yourself. Understand when you see the stuff in the world, as you respond to that, as you reflect on it, what it causes you to do is to come to a greater level of personal clarity and commitment to what it is that Jesus has done and is doing, and you entrust yourself to him in much the same way as the widow who took her last 2 little copper coins and put them in the treasury.
Right.
Okay. In God's kingdom, God takes care of his people.
Okay.
And so you can trust him, you can rely on him for that, and you don't let the exigencies of life interfere with that core belief, even though the exigencies of life may test that severely, and you will experience all of the anguish and everything that goes with this. But you have this larger perspective that goes on.
Okay.
So let me just tag on to that.
Sure.
I find that besides making better sense of the language of this text in its literary context and the larger scope of canonical storytelling and so forth, I find it's not only that, I just find it much more personally relevant.
Sure, absolutely.
It's much more meaningful to me to understand this is how I respond to the way that life disappoints me and frustrates me and hurts me than it is to say, I think I figured out when Jesus is going to come back and who I should vote for in the next election.
Right.
We had we've had this conversation, not lunch, we had this conversation before about a different passage, but this is what it came down to. As I said, now think about it. What would this have meant if we take it as this kind of future fulfillment to figure out the signs and everything? What would that have meant to the people to whom Jesus was speaking at the time? It's like, they just become kind of almost like figures, non-player characters in this kind of play that have no real purpose.
That is so true. I mean, this is the indictment of most of what one hears about the book of Revelation.
Right.
Oh wow. So like we're the only people who can possibly understand this because
at this stage. And it in a sense, what we are always talking about, as you've done here, put it in its literary and its historical context, it's almost doing exactly the opposite. To be properly understood, it must be ripped out of its historical context in order to make sense.
And the amazing thing is, when you read these texts in their literary and historical context, they make a lot more of a difference to you now.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's difficult. I know you've had this happen too, where you'll be doing this kind of stuff, and people are like, "Oh, well, but the Bible should be relevant to me," and all this kind of stuff, and you're like, "It is," but you need to understand it.
I remember this vividly. I was teaching a course in hermeneutics, as one does
Of course,
back in the day, and we were doing our one-day hit on the interpretation of Revelation.
Right.
And there was a guy in the class who said, "So you're telling me that the book of Revelation is like one big get well card?" And I said, that may be a bit of an overstatement.
Right.
A little reductive.
Right, exactly.
But
you're on the right track.
Right. You're not far from the kingdom of heaven.
And he said, well, I just can't believe that. And I said, well,
Yes.
maybe you've never been sick.
Right.
There's some other elements of that story I won't get into.
Well,
I mean, there was another chapter, but
Yeah.
but discretion. Believe it or
Right.
not, I have some discretion. I won't tell the rest of that story.
That's good.
Yeah,
I like that.
But I mean, suffering people have always understood how to read Revelation.
Sure. Yeah.
Or Job or anything. The
Right.
Psalms.
It's good. Yeah. Do you have any questions for John on this? Or?
No, I mean, I appreciate this to walk through this and again, put it in that context so we can read
Right.
through this to see, because I think I had a conversation with someone once who was really hung up on this.
Yeah.
Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass
Right.
away. And it's thinking like, well, is it talking about when the temple gets torn down? Like what's happening here?
Right.
And to think through some of those things, again, this kind of goes back to Speech Act a little bit, but like, how would they have heard this? And
Sure.
what's the main message here? And I think that's really an important piece for us. Again, as we've been talking context and hearing how they would have heard it, but
Right.
I'd never thought of, Luke in that context. It's the prophetic nature and how that all, I mean, I knew it was prophetic parts of it, but how that all played out together. So I think it's really important for us to think about the Gospels in that way.
That's good. I now forgot what is the.
Yeah,
That was profound. I forgot what I was going to say.
I guess my question, we've already kind of talked about this, but it's always, so what? What do we?
Well, and I think
you've
John's
hit on that.
kind of really given us a good idea of that the whole way through, and in a sense that it's really about how do we respond to the things that are going to go on in the world, even to in our current context.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
When I think a lot of people socially located approximately where the three of us at the table are very concerned about the condition of the church in American culture, in Western culture, the rise of the nuns, to borrow a phrase of one of your earlier guests, all of that. And the message here is situation normal.
Right.
Not that we celebrate that, not that we're glad about it, but we don't imagine that there's something terrible happening, or even that it's because of some enormous failure on our part that this is going on.
Right.
In many respects, the seed falls where it falls.
Right.
To use a reference to another of Jesus' parables, obviously. But, and so we're not indifferent to the kinds of things that we have done, which have been ineffective, unfaithful, inauthentic, etc. But, at the same time, we don't imagine that, well, if America is no longer a Christian nation, whatever that means, then the world is going to heck in a handbasket.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to say that regarding the seed. I mean, even Jesus is saying there are those who are not going to receive my message now, and clearly there weren't.
Yeah.
So.
I've got a jaundiced view of American history. I don't think we've ever been very Christian.
I think not in the sense that some people use it. I think
no, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, nominally, sure. I mean, was there a kind of a nod to God in the past that might not be there presently?
Right.
Yeah, but what good is a nod to God?
Yeah, I think that and it's in some ways kept us from a deep discipleship that deals with these very kind of issues that Jesus is dealing with here. That how do we respond when things are not going the way that we feel like they should? It may be a fine worldview when everything is hunky dory, but what do we do when kind of it gets into these tougher periods?
Well, and Jesus says it best: be careful of your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness. Like don't get the anxiety about it. Like it's it's like I've got this.
Don't self-medicate.
Right.
There you go.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. Well, John, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
There was tons that you want in this, and so I really appreciate it.
Including
appreciate your
cookies.
time. And including cookies, which we will not eat on camera or while we're talking. So appreciate it so very much. All right. See you next Tuesday.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.